here since I wrote most of the book and did a lot of the revisions while I was at George Mason. So it feels a little bit like coming home. This is my baby. The book is called Communist Rhetoric and Feminist Voices in Cold War America. I spaced, even though I left myself a note on my phone to print flyers, I forgot to do that. But so if you're interested in procuring a copy, I have coupons and that good stuff. You'll just have to send me an email. Once again, I feel like I owe you a caveat in that this isn't really a book about character assassination. It's a book about credibility and ethos. But if you know much about the history of the old left in the United States, you know that red baiting has always been a significant component of political organizing around labor. Again, I'm a rhetorician, so I'm interested in how and when things are persuasive. To find the things that I analyzed in this book took about 5 years of archival research at the Wisconsin Historical Society and at the Tamament Library at NYU. But here's the book's central claim. Communist women's speeches, pamphlets, newspaper articles, and activism sustained feminist advocacy during a conservative time period. And I'll talk about what that time period is and what it means in a second here. Here are some of the key figures that I was observing and learning from as I read their texts. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is the one you might have heard of. This is a picture of her from her youth. She started her long career in the American labor movement in the 19-teens. Claudia Jones was the most prominent and high-ranking black woman in the American Communist Party, born in Trinidad and Tobago and then immigrated to the United States before ultimately becoming deported. But around them, sort of a cluster of radical women gathered who were writing, speaking, organizing, theorizing. How is it that you think about what women do, what women's work means during the 1940s and 1950s? So the book examines the time period of 1945 to 1956 as we're building on the prosperity of World War II and slipping into the Cold War. And of course, the height of the Cold War, the prosperity of the Cold War plays out very much on the domestic scene. The study ends in 1956. And again, if you know anything about the history of the old left, you'll know that in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered a secret speech. It wasn't actually secret, it was published in the newspapers, but we call it that, where he detailed the crimes of Stalin and the gulags, and that basically led to the bottom falling out of the American Communist Party, and they basically became a much less significant force in the labor movement. Again, character assassination isn't a central concept in the book, although we see the very real effects of character assassination throughout because of the prominence of red baiting in the US labor movement. In order to write the book, I had to recover a history. Unsurprisingly, feminists in the 1960s and 1970s weren't really stoked to claim the mantle of the old left, given the long shadow of McCarthy that had denigrated their contribution. As I mentioned, the book is centrally about ethos, and ethos means how speakers, persuaders build credibility. It's one of Aristotle's 3 persuasive appeals. If you were here 2 years ago, you'll note that in my absence, I delivered a presentation that looked at ethos in an exchange between Edward R. Murrow and Senator McCarthy, and I looked at 3 ways that ethos was developed on the part of the attacker, on the part of the responder, and in a communication interaction of procedures. So I've already argued for the significance of ethos in understanding character assassination. But what I was trying to understand in this project is how is it that communist women built credibility to theorize, argue, and think about how gender oppression worked alongside racial oppression and class-based oppression. And the fact that they had to build their credibility was significant, because keep in mind that the American Communist Party had built its foundations on the theories of Marxism and Leninism, which prioritized understanding class, often at the detriment of understanding how gender and race were both different from, but also related to class-based oppression. So I promise I don't divide every research paper I write into 4 key areas. But this is just sort of a quick sample of some of the key strategies I identified that communist women were using to build their credibility. The first was relying on a personal tone. So Elizabeth Lawson, who was a party journalist who spurred a significant debate in the 1950s about whether we should pay women for housework, wrote this. I lived for 2 years in the Soviet Union. During these years, I did no housework whatsoever. I had a 2-room apartment in a family hotel, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a stall shower. I had no cooking facilities. The hotel restaurant was open 24 hours a day. So again, building on her personal experience of spending time in the Soviet Union to argue for what socialized housework might look like in the United States. But again, because the American Communist Party was so heavily theoretical, communist women had to build theory too, and to speak in the voice of theory. So Claudia Jones wrote this: "An outstanding feature of the present stage of the Negro liberation movement is the growth in the militant participation of Negro women in all aspects of the struggle for peace, civil rights, and economic security." It's not really a landmark quote, but what I want you to take out from that is a straightforward, unembellished, sort of boringly framed, straightforward, theoretical type tone there. Along with building theory was taking communist men to task for not abiding by the theory of the party, right? So in one of the landmark pamphlets published by Betty Millard in 1948, she said this: "Even many otherwise progressive men cling to their vested interest in male superiority, and many women are so committed to the seeming security of their inferior yet protected position that they echo the voteless, propertyless, completely dependent women of a century ago who declared to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony that they already had all the rights they wanted." So again, saying it's not just about the bad, rich people, that progressive and communist men are also guilty of oppressing women as well. Claudia Jones echoes this message. She writes, "One of the crassest manifestations of trade union neglect of the problems of the Negro woman worker has been the failure not only to fight against relegation of the Negro woman to domestic and similar menial work, but to organize the domestic worker." So here it's not just men that are being hypocritical for not abiding by theory, it's trade unions for not trying to organize domestic workers. Another strategy that communist women used was drawing inspiration from the Soviet Union. A number of women had had the chance to travel to the Soviet Union in relation to their work with the American Communist Party, but propaganda magazines like Soviet Woman also circulated in English, again as an arm of the Soviet government. So Millard, in the pamphlet I already mentioned, says this: "We can see that it is the delimiting of women to the role of wife and mother that is responsible for the superficial values thrown at us from every page of women's magazines. After 100 years of the modern struggle for women's equality, Soviet women are urged in their magazines to educate themselves and grow, to fulfill their production quotas and thus add to the happiness and well-being of the nation. Well, judging from the number of square feet given over to the subject in every issue of the Ladies' Home Journal, the highest ideal of American womanhood is smooth, velvety, kissable hands." So again, saying that Soviet women have a better deal in that they're asked to be full citizens of the country. Last strategy that I'll identify here is outward statements of strength and militancy. And this was particularly important given that many of these women would end up going to jail for their beliefs. So Elizabeth Gurley Flynn ultimately ends up spending a fair amount of her 60s in jail for violating the Smith Act. But as she's standing before the judge, she says this: "Your Honor, my first impulse was to remain silent during this last act of our trial, which I feel could have been foretold in April 1952, way back when it began. Your Honor undoubtedly has the list of our names and sentences already in mind, and this procedure will cause no change. In spite of a sense of futility which grew with every passing day of this frustrating trial, I must speak out, however. Silence might be construed as defeatism when the truth is that I am so serene in our consciousness of innocence of any crimes that I can be imprisoned, but I cannot be corrected, reformed, or changed." Throughout the rest of this speech, she situates her activism in a really long career of working for the American labor movement. Claudia Jones echoes that message before she also goes to jail, talking about her experiences growing up poor in New York that led her to her long career of activism with the American Communist Party. So again, not a book about character assassination per se, but I want to tease out some lessons for those of us that do study character assassination. The first is the significance of the Communist Party as an institutional home and structure. Communist women gained a great deal of publication support and the ideological underpinnings from their association with the Communist Party. Of course, given the red baiting at the time, it undoubtedly limited the staying power of their words, but nonetheless gave them a home, a starting place for jumping off and doing this theorizing. But the role of institutions is also one of the other most significant things here. Almost all of these women had encounters with the penal system, either in going to jail or standing trial, but the judiciary as well, when it handed down Dennis v. U.S., a Supreme Court decision in 1951, basically gave the government the green light to continue to investigate communist associations, and as a result, gave sort of the punishing power of this red baiting character assassination issue. Of course, we know that activists seek audiences, and therefore character assassination becomes a powerful way to limit their power and to contain them. Even as you saw Flynn giving a defense of free speech, even when they connected their activism to things like freedom of speech and American ideals, didn't work. They still went to jail. Wah, wah. One of the other things that this case illustrates is the material consequences of prolonged and sustained character attacks. You see Malcolm X here holding Jones's obituary. She gets deported to England, and ultimately this long career in and out of jail takes a real material effect on her. And as a result, she dies in her 50s quite early on in her career. Many of these other women also had their families destroyed when they or their husbands ended up in jail and suffered the long consequences of continual surveillance and the pressure of being constantly watched by the US government. Last thing I want to note is the ethical considerations, and this gets to some of the questions that have already been swirling around about the truth of character attacks, right? These women were smeared in sort of a guilt by association and a label as communist. But they were communists, right? So that was actually true. But nonetheless, I'm not willing to say that this character assassination attempt was justified. This was something that I wrestled with in the McCarthy paper as well. The all-out attack on the Communist Party at the time is greatly overblown given the power that the Communist Party had in the United States. We tend to think about communists as tapped into this international network of spies. That is not the reality of what was happening with the American Communist Party in the mid-1950s. So it's certainly an overblown reaction to what communists were doing. I tend to buy into Doug Walton's theorizing about ad hominem attacks, and he suggests that, in fact, there are a great many moments when ad hominem attacks are not logical fallacies, that they are relevant and important parts of political debates. So I don't want to dismiss all character attacks as a bad thing to happen in political discourse, although I do think we need to think a little bit about, in this case, we have both an instance of a true character attack alongside material and ethical considerations about whether it was overblown, given the power of the Communist Party in the United States at the time. So hopefully those lessons are interesting and tantalizing to you, even though the book sort of dances around the idea of red baiting in the labor movement in the United States. But I will stop there, happy to answer more questions, and looking forward to hearing from the rest of our panelists.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. So make sure to check out the book, Communist Rhetoric and Feminist Voices in Cold War America. And next we're going to have Colleen Kelly, who's going to be speaking about the book, A Rhetoric of Divisive Partisanship, the 2016 American Presidential Campaign Discourse of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump.
Okay, thank you. Make sure I shadow my students and make sure I have my timer up with me so that I don't get frowned at. So, let me begin by saying that what I actually am going to share with you this morning is a mash-up of my book and its premises, which I will leave to the flyer that has been so conveniently and kindly put into your folders. And my current research trajectory in the last year since it was published about a year ago. I am fundamentally interested in the American presidency and the current presidency at a time that I'm doing my research. So I was compelled, beginning early in 16, to give you just a minute's worth of backstory here, by what I saw to be twin campaigns that were being waged by fringe candidates, and I don't mean in terms of their personalities, but Mr. Trump clearly, I'd already articulated, was appealing to what I wish it was my term, but it's not, was his orphaned electorate. I also saw Bernie Sanders doing the same thing, and it took me about 2 months to realize they seemed to be mirroring each other. So I will leave it at that. What I end up with in the conclusion of my book is that there were numerous factors and parts in play here, but Mrs. Clinton certainly was fighting not only the CA and the general campaign success of the handlers of Mr. Trump, but she was also fighting Mr. Sanders. And there were many other factors, and I do go into those in my text. So where my jumping off point is here, when I saw the call for papers, I immediately was connected with my own research and thought there's a trajectory here. So much as we just heard, my paper and my book are not specifically identifying CA, but I certainly have references to them, and you can make your own connections as I proceed here. I have a lot of text. I apologize for that. I certainly will share the PowerPoints with you. I think they're made available at the end of the conference. But the point is, I do start arguing that we know in the last 4 decades democracies have been under assault, quote unquote, for various reasons, and I identify several with different stages of difficulty in maintaining their democratic ideologies. Jump to the bottom of the slide. The point that I focused on mostly was populist nationalism, and I know we have agreed upon the fact that populism, much like the term I'm going to be using here, I hope not recklessly in a few minutes, fascism can be broadly defined. But I particularly want to focus on the UK and, of course, the United States as being democracies that certainly aren't anywhere near flipping. But I have, as a critic, much interest, and as an American, some concern here. Drawing on my book, I note that Trump and Sanders' success is evidence not only that Americans, in my view, are losing their political faith, but that contemporary or modern politics is situated within a populist to fascist continuum. That's not my term, but I took it and added to it, obviously. I do also acknowledge that there are economic and clearly technological historical constraints, but my main focus here is identity politics was the flipping point for Trump's electoral victory, and I do detail that in the book and the paper that accompanies this. It also became an effective delivery system for his presidency, and in my view, continues to do so. So I have defined populism for the paper. I'll scoot by that because we all have a general consensus from what I can tell of what it is. In terms of my reference from the book, I identify Bernie Sanders is a left-wing populist, very successful, and he focused his discourse, as he is starting to do now, early for campaign 2020. I'm seeing identical strategies come to the front here on economic issues. While Mr. Trump was a classic, in my view, right-wing populist who focused and continues to focus his presidency primarily along ethical and national differences. I also consider his kind of populism the prelude to some more dangerous kinds of behaviors. And I argue that because such populist remedies entail the deepening of fractures that they have created, it can be even more nefarious, and that's what I focus on in the remaining part of this paper. I identify on this continuum that Sanders would be most likely on one end is a fully engaged and engaging populist. And then I argue that Donald Trump more likely would be the other end as demagogic, or using a term that I coined in my first book, a proto-fascist leader. And I'll leave that there for you to explore on your own if you wish. Again, just reading the text to you, Trump channeled through digitally mediated rhetoric or discourse, maybe the 21st century impresario of the mob who validated his orphaned electorates or Americans' malice by speaking out loud, and we've talked about this here already, things that people are not sure they have a right to say. Ultimately, this rhetorically created differentiation, in my view, split marginalized voters from the Democratic and Republican mainstream and from each other, and I believe that's where we are right now as of this moment. I do talk about fascism, and I'm not a historian nor a political theorist, but I have played in with this literature quite a bit. So fascism certainly, I don't believe, has emerged anywhere near a mature political system in our country, as it did in its original form in 20th century Europe, as some believe was the only form. That's proprietorship of the term. I don't buy into that, but that's another discussion. Elements, however, of fascist leadership, no matter how we configure it, have surfaced in American political discourse. And fascism, I've given you a definition here that draws on several different perspectives. It all boils down to ultra-nationalism, authoritative leadership, and appeals to a popular base or popular appeals. So I conclude or argue that Trump's behavior, his speech, et cetera, has real and disturbing consequences. I'm very pragmatic and utilitarian in my adaptation of rhetorical theory. I think what it has done is it's normalized what is in many camps still considered intolerable. It's made tolerant or tolerable what is not a civic or normal kind of behavior, even for public life in America. A reminder, rather than diluting the term fascism by mislabeling Trump or dismissing concerns about fascism as quite, quote, mere overreactions or misunderstanding of the term, or to insist that modern discourses and examples are not extreme enough to warrant such a label, I think the threat of normalization is real, and that's one of my main hooks here. Fascist mechanisms achieve power which evolve into fascism, at least in my view, or regimes, only when determined by particular conditions. According to Stanley, each fascist state, if you do buy into the notion there can be multiple kinds of fascist environments, is a state of reflection of the unique tactics of discourse of its most powerful leader. And that's where I move into. The question becomes, at what point and through what rhetorical strategies do such politicians ultimately flip democracies, and who are their causes? So Mr. Trump, I believe his major strategy was to initially attack disillusioned white angry men. His primary assassination technique was tribalized otherness that was so successful. He has become America's first commander in tweet, I don't believe he will be our last. I cited 2017 research study by Pew. You're all aware of this, of the degree to which polarization has occurred politically in our country. And then I updated it to 19. So I found a nice graphic and to show that the parties, Republican, Democrat, are even further apart than they were this time last year. Building on that notion, I define tribalism, which I'm going to skip through because I think most of you have a handle on what that means and what kind of strategies are involved. New media facilitated tribalism, again, is a concept I think that is incredibly entrenched, certainly in a group like this. Digital media, and a quote that I really liked from this source, is no longer merely an echo chamber, but a pinball machine, in which manipulators drop memes to bounce around and amplify. I think the visual imagery of that is really powerful. So Trump has wired-in populism working for him. It facilitates his agenda via digital interaction, and I like, again, this connection. The violence of faction, which in the 18th century James Madison warned about, may be ascendant in our own country. It hasn't gotten there yet, but this is something that, in my research, I'm paying attention to. Digital democracy, democratic fatigue. The American political democracy has evolved over 2 centuries. We have the media equivalent in about 2 decades. And I think there's more there, much more there, certainly, than I can talk about in the next few minutes that I have. Trump's presidency has transfigured, in my view, the United States from illiberal democracy into democratic fascism, or we were in the process. And again, I throw that out for you to kind of think about. I get this group. I know you will be doing that. The 2016 election and the resulting presidency up to and including this moment, in my view, suggest Americans may be ignoring their custodial responsibilities for democracy by turning to hypopartisan demagogues in both parties. And I should put that in bold, in both parties. The electorate, while identity can be used to divide, remember it can also be used to unify. So what I'm going to conclude with very quickly are just some suggestions from my experience and my Americanism about directions that we can go to perhaps remedy or rectify the situation before it moves into a more serious environment. We can join together and facilitate an identity to resurrect a superordinate American identity. And there's been one around for 2 centuries. We just haven't talked about it much in the last 2 years. I'd like to see some honing of crowdsourcing, critical thinking skills to people who are completely unaware that they are unaware. If any of you are familiar with Dunning and Kruger, they've been resurrected in the last couple of years. But they argue that people oftentimes don't realize what their limits are because they don't realize they have limits. And I think something as simple as that kind of, did you know this, or what do you think about this, interjected into our public narrative might not be a bad idea. In so doing, we might reinstate or encourage skills such as civic education. I have a lot to think about and contribute to the dialogue about CA and whether truth can be part of CA, et cetera, et cetera. But I think civic responsibility is big here, and a practical application of our constitutionally derived values into public awareness. Finally, I'd like to see us counter the dominant, negative, distorted, mediated images narrative that's out there with positive and more accurate images. Not necessarily just drop the vitriol, but make sure we strive for accuracy and civility simultaneously. I also think politicians could do well by being more media savvy. Mr. Trump and his handlers were brilliant. There were others as well, but Mr. Sanders is carefully shown that he's starting to raise his level of expertise as well. Now, the American electorate, I also argue, as a good audience, and you can look up that term if you want. I write about it in my book, which participates in a narrative of constitutional patriotism. I wish it was my phrase, it's not. May counter the illiberal rhetorical maladaptation of the 45th presidency. So I conclude with this. There's a challenge. The challenge is to develop and reinvent a paradigm for the remaining 21st century American presidencies so that Plato's shadow, look it up, does not become democracy's trajectory in the United States. I do argue fascism could emerge in any of these venues. It certainly hasn't emerged in the United States. And perhaps if we do some of these things, it will be less likely to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colleen, in her book, A Rhetoric of Divisive Partisanship. Next, we're going to have a former Mason professor, Stephen Farnsworth, who's going to be talking about his work for presidential communication and character, White House news management from Clinton and cable to Twitter and Trump. He's now at the University of Mary Washington.
Thank you so much. My perspective with respect to character assassination really deals with the question